In the last video, we left off in 1922 in October, where you have several hundreds of thousands of fascists march on Rome, which causes the king to put Benito Mussolini in power. And this picture right over here is from Mussolini coming to power from the March on Rome. And not only does he get appointed as prime minister, but he has dictatorial powers for 1 year. And those dictatorial powers are also backed up with the black shirts, this loose band of a paramilitary group. And so he uses his powers and the fact that he has this his own force, so to speak, to continue to just secure more and more power under him over the next few years. By 1923, he makes the black shirts become part of become a formal national militia, essentially the volunteer militia for national security. And in Italian, the acronym is the MVSN. So the black shirts become formalized as the MVSN. He also gets Parliament, or gets the legislature, to pass what's known as the Acerbo Law, or Acerbo Law. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing it. Acerbo Law. And this is an interesting one, because this is a law that allowed whichever majority party, as long as that majority, or I should say majority party, whatever the largest party in the deputy of ministers, whatever the largest party in Parliament is, that party, as long as they get more than 25% of the vote, they will get 2/3 of the seats in Parliament. And this is strange, because traditionally in a parliamentary system, if you got, even let's say you were the largest party and you got 26% of the vote, you still would not have enough seats to govern properly. You would have to form a coalition with several other parties so that you could essentially form a government. But this is saying that whoever gets the plurality of votes, who gets the most votes without necessarily being a majority, they will by default become a majority. And you can imagine why the fascists wanted this to happen. They felt that they could get 25% of the votes, one maybe through popular support, but also with the help of the coercive tactics of the black shirts, and then that would give them stronger control in the legislature. Now the big question is why would the legislature pass this? Because at this point, the fascists were not the dominant party. They did not have a majority in the legislature. In fact, this is why they wanted to pass the law, because they didn't have a majority. And once again, it's one of those questions of history. Some would say that there was actually, people were enamored with the fascists. They were enamored with Mussolini. They were eager to have strong leadership. They didn't want this government of coalitions. They wanted one government to be able to take action. And on the other side, when the votes were happening, you actually had black shirts in the room. So one argument is that there was also an element of pure intimidation. But needless to say, the Acerbo Law, or Acerbo Law, actually passed. But there's an irony here, because it was unnecessary. In 1924, when you actually have elections, you have the fascists getting 2/3 of the vote. Fascists get 2/3 of the vote. Now, many today and many in Italy at the time felt that this was a fraudulent election. They felt that the reason why the fascists were able to get so many votes is that because they were able to intimidate folks, they were able to commit fraud during the election, that they were able to kind of throw other votes out. And one of the most outspoken individuals when it came to criticizing the fascists and their tactics of coming to power was Giacomo Matteotti, and he wrote a book about the fascists. He gave 2 really strong speeches in the deputy of ministers, where he talks about or the chamber of deputies, I should say, where he talks about the kind of the corruption and the violence of the fascists. And a few days after giving those speeches, he gets killed by black shirts. So he gets actually quite violently murdered by black shirts. And this puts this puts Mussolini in, at least initially, a bit of a bind. He doesn't want to look like a thug, someone who goes out and just murders people. It's not clear that Mussolini was involved in this in any way, but his followers had committed this act. And to protest against the murder of Giacomo Matteotti, you actually have the entire Socialist Party boycotts Parliament. And this is known as the Aventine Secession, or at least the 20th century Aventine Secession. Aventine Secession. It's called the Aventine Secession because if you go back to Roman times 2,500 years ago, you had the plebeians secede out of protest from harsh rule, and they go to the Aventine Hill. And so it was named after that same idea. And the whole reason why the socialists did this is they hoped that by boycotting Parliament, that would convince the king to get rid of Benito Mussolini. And Mussolini, at the same time, he's also in a bind. He doesn't know quite what to do. And on top of all of this, the black shirts are telling him, look, if you don't take control of the situation, if you don't become a strong ruler, we're going to do it without you. We might even overthrow you, Mr. Mussolini. And so in 1925, early 1925, Mussolini makes his famous January speech. 1925. His famous January speech. And this is normally viewed as the formal start of his absolute dictatorship. In this, Mussolini, instead of the Aventine Secession somehow undermining Mussolini's power, because the king did not dismiss Mussolini, it actually strengthened Mussolini's power. He used that as a pretext. He said, look, all of these deputies, they've decided not to show up at Parliament. They've essentially given up their seats, and he bans the Italian Socialist Party. He embraces the black shirts. He takes responsibility for them. He doesn't take responsibility directly for Giacomo Matteotti's murder, but he takes responsibility for the black shirts. And he gives, in kind of classic Mussolini style, a somewhat convoluted argument about how strength and violence is going to give stability to the Italian people. Obviously, he's an amazing orator. He's very charismatic. And this essentially gives him the control he needs. And by the end of 1925, you have the Christmas Eve law that's passed by Parliament that essentially puts no checks on Mussolini's power. And as you go then into 1926, they more and more, the fascists under Mussolini, take absolute control, absolute power of Italy, banning. So 1926, they're banning other parties. So other parties are banned. They're starting to force people to become members of the fascist party if they want roles in the government or even in any type of institution. They're starting to take control of the press. They're starting to have a very strong state police architecture. And if this looks familiar based on what we studied about the Nazis, it's not a coincidence. Hitler was he admired Mussolini. In fact, Mussolini's March on Rome inspired Hitler to attempt his beer hall putsch in 1922 or in 1923. A lot of these tactics that brought Mussolini to power, you see it kind of a parallel in what brought Hitler to power only about 7 years later.